I am standing in my cousin Celia's kitchen on a rainy Tuesday evening in September, staring at a wedding invitation that was never sent to me. The envelope lay on the counter between us, with my sister's name embossed across the front in gold script. Lennox Calloway requests the honor of your presence. There was no second envelope tucked behind it. There was no card with my name on it. Celia looked at me the way people look at someone they are about to apologize for, and I told her it was fine before she could say a word. It was not fine. But I had years of practice saying it was. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. If this story touched you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. My name is Nora Calloway. I was 27 that September, and I had not set foot in my father's house in the town of Millbrook for nearly 4 years. My father, Walter Calloway, was the kind of man who wore pressed shirts to church on Sunday and kept his voice low enough that strangers mistook his silence for dignity. My mother, Elaine, passed away when I was 9 after a long illness that took the color from her face and something from my father that he never gave back. He remarried within 18 months to a woman named Gretchen, who spoke softly and crossed her arms whenever I entered a room. Lennox was born when I was 12. She was my half-sister, but no one in that house ever used that word. What they used was the girls, and what they meant was Lennox, and occasionally, as an afterthought, me. From the time Lennox was old enough to walk, my father treated her with a softness that surprised people who knew him only as a man who spoke little and praised less. He bought her a piano. He drove her to lessons twice a week. He sat in the front row at every recital and recorded the whole thing on his phone. I learned to play by pressing the keys after everyone had gone to bed, with the pedal down so the sound wouldn't carry. No one heard me. No one asked. By the time I was 16, I understood the architecture of our household. My father loved the child who reminded him of nothing. I reminded him of everything. My mother's forehead, my mother's handwriting, my mother's habit of standing by the window when it rained. I was a ghost he had to feed, and he resented me for it in the quiet way that resentful men do. Not with shouting, not with fists, but with absence. A birthday he forgot. A parent-teacher conference he could not attend. A high school graduation where his seat stayed empty because Lennox had a recital that same evening. He could not be in 2 places at once, he said. He could. He chose. When I was 19, he told me the house was too full. Gretchen stood behind him in the hallway with her arms crossed, and Lennox, who was 7, sat on the bottom step of the stairs watching, with the blank curiosity of a child who has already learned which side of the room to sit on. I packed 2 suitcases that night. I left the next morning with $40 in my wallet and a bus ticket to Hartford that my Aunt Doreen had mailed to me 3 days earlier with a note that said only, "Come, I'll be here." The first 2 years in Hartford were the thinnest years of my life. I worked at a print shop on Park Street where the ink stained my fingers blue and the owner paid me in cash every Friday. I rented a studio apartment above a laundromat where the machines hummed through the floor until midnight and the walls were thin enough to hear my neighbor's television word for word. I ate oatmeal for breakfast, soup for dinner, and nothing in between, unless Mrs. Yee, the woman who ran the accounting office where I eventually found a second job, left a container of rice and vegetables on my desk without saying anything about it. She did that once a week for a year. I never thanked her properly. I didn't know how to thank someone for keeping you alive without making it feel like you needed keeping alive. There were nights I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and thought about calling my father. Nights when the refrigerator held nothing but a jar of mustard and the rent was 3 days late and the laundromat below me had finally gone quiet. I would pick up the phone and set it down again. I never made the call. I told myself it was pride. It was not pride. It was the knowledge, quiet and certain as a heartbeat, that if I called and he did not answer, I would not survive the silence. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. I did not know it then, but my father had told the rest of the family that I had left on my own, that I was unstable, that I had refused help he had offered. I learned this later, in pieces, from Celia, who called me one evening and said she was sorry she hadn't reached out sooner. She said Gretchen had told everyone I had walked out after an argument and refused to come back. She said my father had told the family not to contact me because I needed to learn responsibility. She said all of this in the careful, apologetic voice of someone who is realizing, slowly, that she has been lied to. 3 weeks before the wedding, I called my father's house for the first time in 2 years. Gretchen answered. Her voice was the same soft voice she had always used with me. the one that sounded like an apology she never intended to make. I asked if I could attend Lennox's wedding. There was a pause. Then she said, "Walter thinks it would be better if this one stayed small. Close family only." I asked what close family meant. She said, "You know what it means, Nora." I hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed in the studio above the laundromat, and I looked at the wall, and I thought about the word close, and how it can mean near, and it can mean shut. And in my family, it had always meant both. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late October at a country club in Millbrook that I had driven past 100 times as a child. I was not there. I learned about it from Celia, who texted me a single message that evening. "It was beautiful. She's happy." I did not reply. I turned off my phone and went to sleep at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night in an empty apartment. And the rain came in around midnight and tapped against the window above the fire escape. And I lay awake listening to it, and wondering if Lennox had worn her hair up or down, and whether my father had cried, and whether there had been a seat in the front row with no one in it, and whether anyone had noticed. Celia called me the following Thursday. She said she had something to send me. She said she wasn't sure if she should, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. I asked her what it was. She said it was a photograph from the wedding, and that she had taken it from her seat in the third row, and that when she looked at it later on her phone, she noticed something she couldn't stop noticing. I asked her what she meant. She said, "Just look at it, Nora. Look at her hand." The photograph arrived in my inbox that evening. I opened it on my laptop at the kitchen table, the same table where I ate soup and paid bills and studied for my accounting certification. It was a wide shot of the ceremony. Lennox stood at the altar in a white dress, with her back half turned toward the man she was marrying. My father stood beside her in a dark suit. Gretchen sat in the front row, with her hands folded. The church was full. Every seat was taken, except one in the third row on the left side, where a small card reading "Reserved" leaned against the back of the empty chair. I zoomed in. I zoomed in on Lennox's left hand, the one resting on top of her bouquet of white roses. And there, on her ring finger, below the wedding band that Grant Aldridge had just placed there, was a second ring. It was narrow and gold, with a small diamond set in the center, flanked by two smaller stones. I knew that ring. I had known it since I was 5 years old, since the mornings when my mother would sit me on the bathroom counter and let me hold her hand while she brushed my hair. I had pressed my thumb against that diamond 1,000 times. It was my mother's engagement ring. The one my father had given Elaine Marsh on a Sunday afternoon in March. The one she never took off, not even in the hospital at the end. I sat very still. I looked at the ring on the screen. I looked at it for a long time. That night, I called Aunt Doreen. I told her about the photograph. I told her about the ring. There was a silence on the line that lasted so long, I thought she had hung up. Then she said, "Nora, your mother left a letter. She left it with me. I've been waiting for the right time to give it to you, and I think the right time just arrived." I drove to her house the next morning. It was a cool October morning, the kind where the trees have turned, but the air still holds something warm underneath. She lived in a small white house with a garden in the back and a cat named Bishop who sat on the porch railing and watched me park. She made tea. She set a bowl of chicken soup in front of me because she said I looked like I hadn't eaten a warm meal in a week, and she was not wrong. Then she went to her bedroom and came back with a small leather box and a sealed envelope. The envelope was yellowed at the edges. My mother's handwriting was on the front. It said, "For Nora, when she is ready." I opened it at the kitchen table, with the soup cooling beside me and Bishop purring on the chair across from me. Inside was a single page, written in my mother's hand, dated 3 months before she died. She wrote that she was leaving her personal effects to me, specifically. Her engagement ring, a small savings account she had opened before her marriage, in her own name, with a balance she described as "not much, but mine." A pearl brooch that had belonged to her mother. She wrote that she had asked Walter to make sure I received these things when I was old enough, and that she had put the instructions in writing because she wanted no ambiguity. She signed it Elaine Calloway, and beneath her signature she had written the name of the attorney who had helped her draft it. A man named Hale, with an office in the next town over. I read the letter twice. I held the leather box in my hands and did not open it. I asked Aunt Doreen why she had waited. She said, "Your mother told me to wait until you needed it. Not wanted it, needed it." She said you would know when. I asked her if she knew about the ring, if she knew Lennox was wearing it. She said she had not been invited to the wedding either. She said Walter had stopped returning her calls after my mother died, and that she had let it go, because she did not want to make things harder for me. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. That evening, I went home to my apartment in Hartford, and I sat at my table, and I looked at the letter, and I thought about what to do. I could let it go. I could accept that my father had given my mother's ring to Lennox, and that the savings account had likely been emptied years ago, and that no amount of letters from the dead would change what had already been done. I could do that. I had survived worse. But I had also built something in those 4 years that I had not expected to build. I had passed my accounting certification in June. I had been promoted at the office. Mrs. Yee had given me my own client list. I had moved out of the studio above the laundromat into a one-bedroom apartment with a window that faced east and a kitchen with a counter wide enough to spread my work across. I had a savings account with $900 in it, which was the most money I had ever had at one time in my life. I was not rich. I was not safe. But I was standing on ground I had built myself. And standing on your own ground changes what you are willing to accept from the people who pushed you off theirs. What I learned the following week changed everything. I called the attorney. His name was Robert Hale, and his office was in a town called Westbrook, 20 minutes from Millbrook. I told him who I was. I told him my mother's name. There was a pause, and then he said, "I've been wondering when someone would call about this." He asked me to come in. I drove down on a Saturday morning with the letter in my purse and the leather box on the passenger seat beside me. His office was on the second floor of a brick building above a hardware store. The stairs creaked. The waiting room smelled like old paper and coffee. He was a tall man in his 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a desk covered in files. He asked me to sit down. He asked me if I had the letter. I gave it to him. He read it, nodded, and opened a drawer in his filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder. He said, "Your mother came to me in the last year of her life. She was very specific. She wanted certain things to go to you and only you. She filed a written instruction with my office. I sent a copy to your father after she passed. I followed up twice. Both times he told me it had been handled." He paused. "Based on what you're telling me about the ring, it was not handled." He showed me the file. There was a copy of the letter I had just read, and behind it, a second document. A formal instruction filed with his office, signed by my mother, listing the items she wanted me to have. The engagement ring, the savings account, which she had transferred to a trust in my name before she died, with a balance at the time of $14,000. The pearl brooch. There was a third document behind those two, a letter from my father, dated 6 weeks after my mother's death, stating that he had distributed the effects as Elaine wished, and that both girls had been provided for. It was signed Walter Calloway. I looked at that letter for a long time. I looked at his signature. I recognized the handwriting. It was the same hand that had signed my report cards and written Lennox on the birthday cakes, and filled out the forms that said the house was too full. $14,000. My mother had saved $14,000 over 12 years of marriage, in her own name, in a trust for me, and my father had written a letter saying it had been handled. The ring was on Lennox's finger. The savings account, I would learn later, had been closed and merged into a joint account under Walter and Gretchen's names the year my mother died. Mr. Hale asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I didn't know. He said that was fair. He said the written instruction and his office's records were clear evidence that my mother's wishes had been ignored. He said he could send a formal letter to my father requesting an accounting of the estate. He said he could request a meeting. He said, "Sometimes a letter is enough. Sometimes people would rather settle quietly than have this come out in front of their family." I thought about that. I thought about Lennox wearing my mother's ring at her wedding while I sat in an apartment in Hartford eating soup alone. I thought about the empty chair in the third row with the reserved card on it. I thought about my father telling everyone I was unstable, that I had refused help, that I needed to learn responsibility. And I thought about my mother sitting in Mr. Hale's office in the last year of her life, writing down what she wanted me to have, because she knew what would happen after she was gone. "Send the letter," I said. Mr. Hale sent the letter on a Monday. He told me to give it 2 weeks. He said that in his experience, families like mine either ignored the letter and forced a legal proceeding, or they agreed to a meeting and tried to settle the matter before it became public. He said either way, I should be prepared for the possibility that my father would deny everything. He said I should also be prepared for the possibility that he wouldn't, Because sometimes, a piece of paper with a dead woman's signature on it is the one thing a man like Walter Calloway cannot argue with. I wasn't there to fight. I wasn't there to argue. I was there for one reason only. The call came 9 days later. It was not from my father. It was from Gretchen. Her voice was different this time. The softness was gone. She said, "Nora, your father received a letter from an attorney. He is very upset. He wants to know why you're doing this." I asked her what this was. She said, "Bringing your mother into this. Dragging up things that were settled a long time ago." I said they were not settled. I said my mother left specific instructions and they were ignored. There was a silence. Then she said, "Lennox doesn't know anything about this. She thinks the ring was a gift. She doesn't need to be dragged into it." I said, "Then maybe Walter should have thought about that before he put it on her finger." Gretchen hung up. That was the first time in my life I had ever heard Gretchen raise her voice, and it was not directed at me in anger, so much as in fear. And I recognized the sound because I had heard it in my own voice on the nights I sat on the floor of the studio apartment and wondered if I was going to make it. A few days later, Celia called. She said my father had been calling relatives. He was telling them that I was trying to sue the family, that I was trying to take money from Lennox, that I had always been jealous and that this was what jealousy looked like when it grew up. Celia said she didn't believe him. She said she had seen the photograph, and she remembered Aunt Elaine wearing that ring every Sunday at church. She said, "Nora, I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I should have asked questions years ago." I told her it wasn't her fault. And then I sat at my kitchen table and I made a decision. I called Mr. Hale and told him I was willing to attend a meeting. I told him I did not want a courtroom. I told him I wanted a room with my father in it, and the truth on a table between us. And that was all. He said he would arrange it. He said he would request that my father bring any documentation related to my mother's estate. He said, "In my experience, the paper does the talking. You won't have to say much." I spent the next 2 weeks living my life. I went to work. I balanced ledgers. I ate lunch at my desk. I walked home in the evenings along Park Street, where the streetlights came on one by one, and the air smelled like coffee from the shop on the corner. I lived my life, because I had learned, in the years since I left Millbrook, that the most defiant thing a discarded person can do is keep living, and keep living well. Not loudly, not for anyone else's benefit. Just keep going. Keep the lights on. Keep the soup warm. Keep the window cracked so the air comes in. The call from Gretchen had unsettled me, but not in the way she intended. She wanted me to feel shame. Instead, I felt clarity. For the first time in my life, I understood that my father's silence and my stepmother's crossed arms and my sister's blank stares were not reactions to something I had done. They were habits. They were the routine of a household that had decided, long before I left, that I was the one who did not fit, and had arranged everything around that decision so neatly that even the truth of my mother's last wishes could be folded up and put in a drawer and forgotten. Have you ever been told you failed by the people who were supposed to believe in you? I did not need them to believe in me anymore. I had stopped needing that a long time ago. On a night in Hartford, when I ate a piece of bread with nothing on it, and decided I would not call my father's house. But I did need the truth. Not for Lennox, not for Gretchen, not for the relatives who had heard the story about the unstable daughter and never thought to ask me if it was true. I needed it for my mother, who had sat in an attorney's office in the last year of her life and written down what she wanted me to have, because she knew what would happen after she was gone. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday in November. Mr. Hale called me the Wednesday before and said my father had confirmed. He said Lennox would be there. He said Gretchen would be there. He said, "Bring the letter. Bring the photograph. I'll bring the file." I asked him if he thought my father would deny it. He said, "He can deny it all he wants. I have his signature on a letter that says he distributed everything according to Elaine's wishes. And I have Elaine's wishes in writing, and those two documents do not agree with each other. That's not my opinion. That's arithmetic." I drove to Westbrook on Saturday morning. It was a cool, clear day. The trees along the highway had dropped most of their leaves, and the fields between the towns were brown and flat and wide. I parked outside the brick building above the hardware store. I sat in my car for 10 minutes with the engine off and the letter in my lap, and the photograph printed on a sheet of paper in a manila envelope beside me. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I was calm in the way that a person is calm when they have already lived through the worst thing, and everything after that is just paperwork. I climbed the stairs. Mr. Hale's office door was open. He was standing by the window with a cup of coffee. He nodded at me and pointed to a chair. I sat down. Across the room, 2 more chairs had been placed against the wall. A small table sat in the center with a box of tissues on it that no one would use. My father arrived at 11. Gretchen was beside him. She had her arms crossed. Lennox was behind them, her face pale and uncertain, the ring on her left hand catching the light from the window. My father wore a pressed shirt. He always wore a pressed shirt. He looked at me and then looked away and sat down in the chair farthest from mine, and the distance between us in that room was not measured in feet. Mr. Hale began. He said he had asked everyone to come because there was a matter regarding the estate of Elaine Calloway that needed to be addressed. He said he had documentation that he wanted to share and that he wanted to give everyone a chance to review it together. He was calm and professional, and he did not raise his voice once. He placed the file on the table. He opened it. He showed my mother's written instruction first, the one she had filed with his office, listing the ring, the savings account, the brooch. He showed the trust document. He showed the bank records indicating that the trust had been closed and the funds transferred to a joint account. He showed the letter my father had written 6 weeks after my mother's death, the one that said everything had been handled. And then he placed the photograph on the table beside the documents, the one Celia had taken from the 3rd row, the one that showed Lennox's left hand resting on a bouquet of white roses with my mother's ring on her finger. Lennox looked at the photograph. She looked at the ring on her own hand. She looked at my father. She said, "Dad, what is this?" My father did not answer. Gretchen said, "This is a family matter. It doesn't require an attorney." Mr. Hale said, "It became a legal matter when a trust was closed without the beneficiary's knowledge or consent." He said it quietly, the way my mother used to say things, and the room went still. Lennox turned to me. She said, "Did you know about this?" I said, "I knew about the ring. I didn't know about the rest until 3 weeks ago." She said, "He told me Mom gave it to me. He told me she wanted me to have it." She was not angry at me. She was not angry at anyone yet. She was in the space between learning and feeling, and her face was doing the thing that faces do when the ground underneath them shifts. My father looked at the table. He looked at the documents. He looked at the photograph. He said, "I did what I thought was right." Mr. Hale said, "You wrote that you distributed the effects according to Elaine's wishes. Elaine's wishes are in this file. They do not match what you did." My father said nothing. Gretchen's arms tightened across her chest. The room was quiet, in the way that rooms are quiet when a lie that has stood for 18 years has just been set on a table in front of the people it was told to. What happened next, I did not expect. Lennox took the ring off her finger. She held it in her palm. She looked at it the way I had looked at it on the photograph, with recognition, with the slow, sick understanding that something you thought was a gift was actually something that had been taken from someone else. She set it on the table beside the documents. She said, "I didn't know." She said it to me, not to the room. She said it again, quieter. "I didn't know, Nora." I believed her. I believed her because I had watched her grow up in a house where the truth was a drawer that stayed shut, and she had been handed a ring at 15 or 16 and told it was hers, and she had worn it to her wedding, believing it was a piece of her mother's love and not a piece of her mother's stolen wish. She was not the villain. She had never been the villain. She was another person in that house who had been told a story and had never been given a reason to question it. I said, "I know." That was all I said. 2 words. I did not say I forgave her. I did not say it was fine. I said, "I know." Because I did know, and because the truth doesn't always arrive when you want it. It arrives when it's ready. My father stood up. He did not look at me. He did not look at Lennox. He looked at Mr. Hale and said, "I'll have my accountant contact you about the trust." Then he walked out of the office. Gretchen followed him. The door closed behind them, and the room was quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes after something heavy has been set down, and the table is still vibrating from the weight of it. Lennox stayed. She asked me if we could talk. I said, "Not today." She nodded. She picked up her purse from the chair, and she walked to the door, and she stopped, and she said, "I'm sorry, Nora. For the wedding. For all of it." I said, "I know." She left. Mr. Hale handed me the ring. He said, "Your mother wanted you to have this." I held it in my palm. It was lighter than I remembered. The diamond was small. The gold was warm from the room. I closed my hand around it, and I put it in my pocket. I walked down the creaking stairs. I pushed open the door at the bottom and stepped outside into the cool November air. The hardware store below was closed. The street was empty. The parking lot behind the building held 3 cars, mine and my father's and Lennox's. And my father's car was already pulling away, taillights disappearing around the corner. I stood in the parking lot with the ring in my pocket and the letter in my purse and the sun on my face, and I breathed. The air was clean. The sky was wide and pale and open. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. I walked to my car. I sat behind the wheel. I did not cry. I turned the key and the engine started, and I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road that led back to Hartford. And the road was long and straight, and the fields on either side were brown and quiet. And I drove home.